Hey everybody, this is Joshua Lewis with the Remnant Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We've got a very exciting episode with Dr. Craig Keener. We're going to be talking about, there goes the camera, egalitarianism. It's going to be a fun theological discussion. If you've watched some of our prior episodes, we've talked about complementarianism and egalitarianism. It's basically talking about women and their function in the church. Dr. Keener is going to give us a presentation, I suppose, on what that definition means to him, since we've got 1 point complementarians and egalitarians now. These terms are almost interchangeable amongst us. We're actually just joking about it before the show. It's been fun. But before we jump in, Miller, cultural update. How are you doing, man?
Cultural update. Man, I would say that I am as excited as can get. Craig, I'm obviously, do you want us to call you Craig or Dr. Keener?
Yeah, Craig.
Okay. I was a huge fan. I mean, from day one, I picked up your book that you wrote on egalitarianism, and I read your 2-volume work on miracles, and I just ate the testimonies up. It made me, it got me excited to see the works of Jesus done and evangelism happen through that. And so, yeah, all week I've been looking forward to this podcast more so than anything, I think, honestly, than any other guest we've
ever
too.
had. Yeah. It's fun when we get to have someone on who we just want to sit and glean. Like, we're going to have an hour of this conversation, and then we're going to want to have another 2 hours of conversation. So it's cool to be able to have someone on that there's just a well of information and knowledge that we can just pull from. Your scholarship on the commentaries that you've written, the gifts of the Spirit, women in ministry. I mean, you've got so
prolific.
I have no idea how you have the time to write all of this content. And then you just released a book that's, I mean, it's much smaller than these other commentaries I just mentioned, with Dr. Brown on a post-tribulation rapture. I mean, you're a busy guy. How many books have you published?
It depends on what stage of publication we're in. I don't remember. I think it's probably 26 now.
26 books.
Okay, so you've got some more work.
I mean, you should probably step it up. I was sitting there telling you about how awesome you were, and then you said 26. I mean, I was looking for somewhere in triple digits, but that's fine. That's cool. 26 is decent. No, it's outrageous.
I wanted to just do commentaries on the whole New Testament,
mm-hmm.
and then start doing something more, something that covers, broader areas of the New Testament, more topically, theologically, or whatever. But I realized at the rate I was going, I would probably be about 100 by the time I finished the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So unless I can really appreciably speed up, I've kind of limited my focus more on which books I'm going to write commentaries on. So
there you go.
I've got your first volume on Acts, and I've barely made my way through it yet. I've just sort of skimmed the surface of it. But where can we get your content? If we want more of your literature, is Amazon the best way to go, or your personal website?
Amazon or Christian Book Distributor. I think it's christianbook.com. And also, you can get free stuff at craigkeener.com.
Do you just write an email in, say, send me free stuff?
No. There's free stuff posted there. There posts, and there's a Bible interpretation manual, but it's all very basic. I mean, it's like intro level. All my academic stuff, of course, is published by publishers who, they own the copyright.
They want money for it.
I can't give those away.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, let's dive into our conversation today. We're going to be talking about women in ministry, the egalitarian position. Give us a definition of egalitarianism as you see it.
Yeah, actually, egalitarian probably isn't the best label that I would come up with.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of a biblical label, probably it would be closer to mutual submission,
mm-hmm.
or closer to the gifts of the Spirit are for everybody. But in terms of the way it's been defined, egalitarian, that there's no difference based on gender in terms of how gifts, including leadership gifts, are given by the Spirit in the body of Christ.
Excellent. So we've been talking the last couple of weeks on this topic. You know, we said First Timothy. Let's give it kind of a presentation of this. Our buddy Jeff Jenkins came on the show, and myself. We both kind of gave a presentation of First Timothy chapter 2, the lower section that talks about, you know, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. That section. And when we're looking at it, we were talking about it. It really comes down to our hermeneutic approach. Like how are we going to read this text? We have, you know, our John Pipers, our Wayne Grudem's who are reading it this way, and we have our Craig Keeners reading it this way. How do you approach the text, and what is that style to determine what is a historical context versus a prescriptive command for all time?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm friends with Wayne.
He likes you. Oh, we've had him on the show, and he's like, I love Keener. Yeah.
I haven't met John Piper personally, but I love his emphasis on glorifying God and so on. So this is, yeah. So our difference on this issue doesn't like spill over into everything else.
Yeah.
But historical context makes a difference, and everybody would, at least all the scholars I know, would recognize that historical context makes a difference in how we apply texts. But the question is, how do we apply it consistently to texts? So, for example, First Corinthians chapter 16 says that we are supposed to set aside money on the first day of the week to send to Jerusalem. And we know from Romans that the Gentile churches owe it to the Jewish church. So there's a theological reason for it, at least in Romans. In 1 Corinthians 16, we don't say, well, no, everybody has to do that. We say that was addressed to the Corinthians. We look for the principle. What can we learn from that in terms of stewardship and so on? Or, and I bring up something from 1 Corinthians because you also have gender-related passages there with regard to women keeping silence in 1 Corinthians 14, and the women wearing head coverings, mainly to cover their hair, which is something I don't really have a problem with. Stop laughing. All right.
You do need a covering, though, where you live.
That's,
yeah.
I'm only laughing because you were singing Where's My Hairbrush before the show.
Yeah. Larry from VeggieTales. But anyway, 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul gives clear instructions: go to Troas, get my cloak, and bring it to me. Now, most of us have never gone to Troas. Most of us have never done any excavations in Troas.
Yeah, amen.
We started that with Heinrich Schliemann in the 1700s.
And they don't make cloaks there anymore.
If we found a cloak that survived, if it happened to be Paul's, how would we know it was Paul's? And then the biggest problem, how are we going to get it to him? He's dead. So don't laugh at that. That's sick. You're sick. Anyway, 2 Timothy chapter 4, it's part of the same set of letters as 1 Timothy. So everybody acknowledges that some things are addressed to particular situations. Now, when we get down to the business of which things are addressed to particular situations, I mean, most of it actually is addressed to particular situations, but draws on universal principles to do so. So the real question is, what are the universal principles in the text? And in some cases, maybe they have to do with gender. In some cases, maybe they have to do with something else. And so the important thing is figuring out which things are which. For example, with head coverings, most churches today, in most parts of the world, although I've taught in places where this is not the case, most churches would say, no, women don't have to wear head coverings in all cultures. It's the principles of the text that are more important.
So in this case, propriety.
Propriety. So as I studied the function of head coverings in Mediterranean antiquity, it became increasingly clear to me that it was a form of sexual modesty. So is it important to be modest and not try to turn the heads of people of the other gender, or of your own gender for that matter? And yeah, well, that seems to be a good principle. It's not just even in 1 Corinthians 11. Does that mean women have to wear hats in all cultures? And most of us would say no. So, and the same with the holy kiss. Like one culture where I was teaching, where head coverings were normative in the church, I raised the question, okay, they're normative in this culture, so they're normative in the church. But how many of you would say they should be normative for all cultures? Well, only half the people raised their hands.
Mm-hmm.
I said, how many of you would say that a woman who goes to church without a head covering will go to hell? One guy actually raised his hand.
Dang.
And after we discussed the cultural context of what some of the issues were in Corinth, he responded, but the Bible says women have to wear head coverings. And I said, yes, but it commands the holy kiss 5 times as often. And yet none of you greeted me with a holy kiss when I came into the room. Nope, too late now. Don't do it now. I'm really into hygiene. Like, don't.
Especially not that guy.
but that was a form of greeting in that culture that you'd use for family members or for people you were close to, or for teachers or students or rulers. You might kiss them on the hand or whatever, but most people, it was a light kiss on the lips, which is, why I was kind of like, don't do that to me. But anyway, my wife only. But anyway.
There you go.
Well, so then I think the question we have is, when do you say, so, I mean, you raised it earlier. You said, what is the way we do this consistently?
Yes.
So when do I know? Like, as the average reader, I mean, I won't know unless I read books of people like yourself who've written on, here's what was normal in that culture. I mean, it's specifically the Ephesus, admonition. It's like, how do I know for sure that this had to do with some cultural thing taking place in Ephesus, and that the church for sure was dealing with that particular problem?
Yeah, and I'm going to cite some principles for this, but also I want to acknowledge up front that there are difficulties with this, and that's when we need to give each other grace on a lot of these issues that are not, at the heart of the gospel, because in some cases it's pretty hard to know. I mean, okay, the writer is drawing on a universal principle to make this particular point. Which is the principle and which is the point? Is the writer stating the principle up front, or is the writer just implicitly drawing on the principle? And you find this even with the head coverings, because some of the arguments that Paul uses some of them would have made a lot more sense in terms of the way argumentation was done in the first century than the way we would try to make the same point today. So we need to give each other grace. And this is one of the issues where we need to give each other grace.
Amen.
Because in terms of, like, right now I'm working on a commentary on 1 Peter, and it seems like most of us who defend the Petrine authorship are evangelicals, and some of the other scholars, not all of them, some of them are very respectful, but some of the other scholars are like, oh yeah, they say that because, what would you expect a conservative scholar to say? Well, all of the external evidence supports Petrine authorship. It seems to me like a no-brainer to go for Petrine authorship. So on some things, a lot of evangelicals, or at least most of us, are taking hits from people who don't like that. But when it comes to issues like this, I mean, you'll have people on either side who'll be attacking the personal faith of the people on the other side of the issue. I used to be on the other side of the issue because I thought that's what the text said. And as I started immersing myself in the world, the first century world, it just seemed to me like this is one of the most obvious issues where the cultural background makes a big difference. So I just say that at the beginning to say, let's give each other grace.
Well, I'd go the extra step and say, I am on the other side of the issue. I am complementarian, and we're having you on the show so that you can get me on the other side of the issue.
Yeah.
So
Oh, wow.
I don't want to be on this side. It just is. This is the side that I see, right? Show me that the grass is greener on the other side.
This is sort of the point of our show too, is to bring in different traditions, people on different side of the spectrum on non-essential issues. So we're not on here debating the virgin birth. We're not on here debating the deity of Jesus. But we are asking the question about complementarian, egalitarian.
And people get to learn with us.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
pick up
There
that
are actually some things where I would like to be on the other side, but I can't be because the text constrains me. But anyway, so I understand that. But I'm not going to try to persuade you to eat grass on either side. I don't think.
Stay away from the grass.
Yes. So in any case, coming back to some principles. One of the principles is there any other place where the author, or is a Christian who believes in the whole canon, any other place where the Bible teaches a different approach? And there are some things where you've got a consistent voice all the way through Scripture. And so, good indication is probably not just cultural, because in a variety of cultures, you've got the same thing. So, for example, on the issue of homosexual behavior, as to whether it's right or wrong, I mean, the Bible speaks with a unanimous voice. We can debate whether this text or that text actually is addressing the issue, but every text that does address the issue, it speaks with a unanimous voice. In the case of the roles of women, we actually have differences. Like in 1 Timothy 5, the woman is supposed to rule the domestic sphere. She's basically confined almost to the home, which was the ideal Hellenistic approach. But in Proverbs 31, the ideal matron is, she buys a field and she sells it. She's doing real estate.
Yep.
She makes textiles.
She's an entrepreneur.
Or Song of Solomon, the woman is working in a vineyard, so agrarian work. So you have different approaches and different passages in light of different cultural expectations in those things. Another principle that is important is whether they're speaking with the culture or against the culture. So sometimes there are things where, First Peter that I'm working on now, there's sometimes where it says, okay, don't rock the boat in the culture on things you don't need to. Or to wives of unbelieving husbands, do what will not offend your husband as much as possible, because, wives were expected to hold their husband's religion. So obviously the Christian wife of a non-believing husband doesn't. Don't cause trouble where you don't need it. Choose your battles, in a sense, because this is where you're going to need it. And I think that's a valid principle for us in a lot of ways, in terms of choosing our battles. Don't fight the culture on things where we don't need to fight them on. But then there are other things where the culture holds diverse views, and the author is very clear. I mean, going back to the illustration I used before, there were different views about homosexual behavior in the Greco-Roman world. The Jewish view was pretty well unanimous. You go through all early Jewish writings. Greeks, though, it was common practice. Greek culture and Roman culture practiced it in somewhat different ways, but yeah, it was a common practice. And so Paul is actually going against the majority of the surrounding culture, and that challenging the surrounding culture.
That actually addresses, I think, one of my slippery soap questions to you is, people will say that once you buy into egalitarianism and you buy into the using that historical context to explain that narrative or explain that text, then the same thing is possible for you to do with homosexuality, which you're addressing that in this conversation, you're saying that was widely accepted, and if anything, Paul was very clearly against it. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah, and then actually, if your hermeneutic is such that you make up cultural background, yeah, you can come up with any explanation you want to. Like, yeah, some explanations that I've heard for defending homosexual behavior, they made up cultural background. Not the one about pederasty. That one actually was the most common expression of it with the Greek practice. But one of the arguments I heard was, well, it's related to idolatry. Well, it wasn't specifically related to idolatry most of the time. I mean, it was polytheists who practiced it, but you can't say, well, Paul just deals with it because it's related to idolatry. And even the pederastic argument, that wasn't necessarily true. It could be, I know I'm getting way off track here, but just to finish the illustration, even with a pederastic argument, it would be boys on the cusp of adolescence, especially prepubescent, and then up through adolescence. And sometimes it carried on beyond that. And in Roman culture, the issue was just, I don't even want to get into some of the stuff, but who's on top?
Yeah.
But in any case, it wasn't exclusively pederastic. And Paul's language, I mean, he could have used such specific language, but
and he
Paul's
chose not
language,
to.
He actually speaks of both genders doing it. And, there's a whole context to that. I don't think we should exaggerate because, Paul's taking an illustration that his Jewish audience, and I think his Christian audience would have agreed with. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can. I'm monitoring questions at the same time that you're talking.
Oh, okay.
And so I've got one for you as well.
Yeah. And Paul goes on to a vice list that includes slander and gossip and all sorts of other things that he says are worthy of death. So I think he's making a graphic illustration of something a lot of his audience would agree with, especially the Jewish members of his audience. But it's to bridge into his argument to show that all of us need Jesus to save us from. But anyway, just to say, yeah, you don't want to make up background. And I had somebody also bring up the argument with me some months ago saying, well, denominations, it's a slippery slope. Once they ordain women, soon they're ordaining people who are practicing homosexual behavior and other things. And I said, that's not the slippery slope. The slippery slope in those particular denominations you're speaking of is not simply that they decided to ordain women. It's that they decided to ordain women by rejecting what Paul said, rather than by understanding them in historical context. It makes a difference.
That's a really good point.
That is a really good point.
I mean, the majority of women who Pentecostals and holiness churches were having women in ministry a long time before what we call more liberal churches were. So we need to be fair about the Salvation Army starting in the, some of this actually goes back to the 1860s, not the 1960s. But anyway, that's another whole other case.
What was the question you had?
Yeah, so this comes from a pastor in Aspen. He said, "It seems to me in dealing with universals, we have to connect all the passages together to make sense. Genesis, Gospels, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, one cultural thing in Ephesus shouldn't overturn the greater universal." What do you think about that?
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you, which is why I asked earlier, but I think I got the question.
Okay.
So, yeah, you need to connect passages together. So which passages are we talking about is a big question. Because, yeah, if you start with Genesis, man and woman together are created in God's image, and together they're to rule the rest of creation. And God makes, in 2:18, God makes a helper suitable for Adam. And the word that's translated as helper, it's a word that's often used for God as our help. I mean, it's not a term of weakness, and suitable means corresponding to. So Genesis, yeah, it depends on how you read Genesis. And then also it depends on what passages you start with. I mean, all through the Bible, men held the majority of ministry positions. That's true. But do we explain that by explaining away all the evidence for women holding some? Or do we say, in other words, do we see the women as exceptions? Or do we see this as a cultural situation where the men dominated? Or do we pretend there aren't any exceptions in the Bible? Or do we pretend that the men didn't dominate? It's...
So like an example would be Deborah was an exception.
Yeah,
if that was the direction
Judges
to go.
4:4. She's a prophetess. She's a judge of Israel. There were only two judges that we know of who were also prophetic voices, and those were Samuel and Deborah. And then you've got other prophetesses, Miriam, Exodus 15. You've got Isaiah's wife. Isaiah chapter 8 is called a prophetess. You've got in Luke chapter 2, you have Anna alongside Simeon. Anna's a prophetess. You have the 4 virgin daughters of Philip in Acts chapter 21, who are there with Agabus is a male prophet. Later in the section, you've got your sons and daughters will prophesy. That's like the norm when the Spirit is poured out. Joel chapter 2 and Acts chapter 2, which in fact was the major text used for supporting women in ministry in the 1700s and 1800s. And then you look at when Paul names his women co-workers. Does he name the most women co-workers? He names a lot of them in Rome, Romans 16, 1-7. In fact, he praises his women co-workers more than his men co-workers in Rome. And also in Philippians 4, verses 2 and 3, we read about women co-workers. Why do they predominate in Rome and Philippi? Well, these were two of the cities in the Roman Empire where women had the most freedoms. So we would expect that women would be more likely to make use of that freedom for the gospel in places where they had it. Well, today, of course, in cultures where women have a lot more freedoms, we would probably expect a larger proportion of women to do various kinds of ministry.
So for clarity's sake, you had brought up Deborah, Old Testament stuff. You talked about some of the women of the Old Testament, like Miriam, but then you said that one of the primary arguments in the 1800s was the Spirit being poured out on all flesh. So would you make the case that in the Old Testament there was a different kind of role for women, and that has now opened up in the New Testament, or like or you see this as a consistent thread throughout Old and New?
I see it more as a consistent thread. I wouldn't see it as a new thing, except that in the Old Testament, prophets were a much more limited group, not just by gender, but I mean, in the New Testament, the idea is the spirit of prophecy is on all believers.
It's very abundant. Yeah, it's very abundant as opposed to very limited. Well,
yeah. And I think that may even be part of the idea. I could be wrong on this, but I think that might even be part of the idea behind Galatians 3:28. I know that there are some other sayings it could be interacting with, but it's interesting in Joel 2:28 and following, chapter 3 if you're reading in Hebrew, but in Joel, you have the Spirit poured out on servants, on both genders, and on young and old. Galatians 3:28, I don't think mentions the young and old, but
the slave and free.
But the slave and free and the male and female.
Yeah.
I think there may be an allusion to.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever made that connection. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, like that we're all. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So following up to that, I just see how I did that. Screwed up the transition.
Yeah.
Following up to that, when we look at Old Testament texts, I would love for you to tackle this. I know this might take us off train just a little bit, but the Isaiah text, such a hard text for me to come to, where it says that women and children rule over you as a judgment of God. I know that's one that the complementarians love to use, that it's the judgment of God when women and children rule over you, that text in Isaiah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, what would be your take on that? When because I know that's one that complementarians throw around to say, hey, well, yeah, there are women who lead in the Old Testament, but God literally told the people like, hey, this is because of judgment. This is not the way I wanted it to be. What would be your take on that?
I think if you are in a masculine culture, the idea of having um, machismo culture, or however we want to
Macho.
put it, macho culture,
It'd be
the
a
idea of
shameful
having
thing in that culture.
rule over you, that's a shameful thing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That a universal, I think that God raises up Deborah shows that it's not. Now, some people say, well, God raised up Deborah because there wasn't a man to do it. If you want to use that argument, look, we've got a few billion people in the world who need to be
Yeah.
reached with the gospel. We got plenty of work that needs to be done. Um,
Would you differentiate at all between, well, I guess, so one of the questions I've got is, in the Old Testament, we mentioned Deborah, who's a judge, and then the rest of the females who had high uh, sort of authoritative positions were prophetesses. Why weren't there female priests or priestess?
Kings. Yeah.
yeah, that was. I see that as a cultural issue as well. Um, some people have tried to use that to say, and they've also used Jesus' 12 apostles being
That was going
male.
to be a follow-up question. Yeah.
And they've said, well, then ministers should be male, but I mean, then ministers also should all be Jewish. Uh, I don't have a problem with ministers being Jewish, but uh, if you make if you limit it to Jewish, most of Jesus' disciples were,
Me for the bill.
most or all of them were Galileans. They spoke Aramaic. I mean, you know,
How far do you want to take it?
None of them
yeah,
wore jeans.
But I
yeah.
think with
I
the
mean,
with
we
the
do have, I think, a woman apostle in the New Testament. That's debated, although I think it probably wouldn't be debated so much if she weren't a woman. Um, Paul Paul mentions, he uses the language of apostleship more broadly than what you have in the Gospels and usually in Acts. So in the Gospels and usually in Acts, it's just the 12. You have one exception in Acts. In Acts 14, a couple times it mentions Paul and Barnabas as apostles. But Paul uses the term more broadly, of course, including himself as an apostle. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 5 through 7, Jesus appeared to the 12 and then to some others and then to all the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
You have Galatians 1:19, James is an apostle. You have probably Silas and Timothy depicted as apostles in Paul's letters. And so Andronicus and Junia, now we were talking about this before the show, and I think you can make a legitimate grammatical case for it being, well, one of my friends, good friends, made a grammatical case for it being, they're just noted among the apostles. But the majority of scholars, including scholars who have responded to that article by my friends, think that you can make a much better grammatical case for it being, these are noted apostles. I mean, nowhere else does Paul appeal to the opinion of the apostles as a group. And that would be kind of hard when you've got apostles all over the place. I mean, it's not just the 12 in Jerusalem. It's, Silas and Timothy over there, and presumably Barnabas and others. So Andronicus and Junia is clearly a woman's name. Yeah, I won't go into all the details.
No,
of that.
I think it's a point that I would like to maybe get a little bit more elaboration on, because in the dialogue that I'm getting online, a lot of the people who are coming to this are like, look, closed case. There's a woman apostle, done, over, and they're making it sound as if the Junia argument is just, it's so obvious, it's so clear cut. Would you say that it's that obvious, or that there is quite a bit of scholarship that still debates this on two different sides? Like, is this still a conversation worth having, or is it like, no, really the majority of the evidence is on Junia here being a female apostle? I mean, I know what your stance is, but is this as rock solid as it's being made out to be online, or is there play in this? Is there speculation on both sides?
I would say the majority of evidence favors Junia being a woman apostle. In terms of it being 100%, I don't think that would be fair. I think that the grammar is still open to some discussion. I have friends who would say no, and they have actually spent more time with that grammar than I have. But I don't like to hang too much on a grammatical argument, giving all the exceptions to everything.
Yeah, sure.
First year Greek is where you learn all the rules. Second year Greek is where you learn all the exceptions, or you learn broader rules that you can't press for so much detail. But in terms of Junia being a woman, I think that's
for sure. We all agree on that. Yeah,
that's settled, or should be settled. I think the evidence is.
So why?
Go ahead.
Maybe this is a dumb question, but why wouldn't? I mean, if is there some reason why Jesus didn't choose a female apostle amongst the 12?
Other than cultural reasons?
He's going to send out the 12, 2 by 2. In terms of harassment, the women are going to face sexual harassment. Normally, you wouldn't send women out traveling in Galilee by themselves. If you send a woman and a man together, it better be either brother and sister or husband and wife. Probably, the Gospels don't say this, but probably from what we know of the culture, Jesus and his group of disciples was criticized enough just for having women traveling with them as a group, like we see in Mark 15 and Luke chapter 8. Huh. So it would not have been safe or advisable to do that unless you had a husband-wife team. Now, later on, we do know that Peter and the other male apostles did have women going out. Well, they had their wives going with them. But at the age that they were, I mean, most disciples back then were teenagers. Peter may have been in his early 20s. He was married, probably had kids at home, though. So he's already bucking the tide of the culture quite a bit, including somewhat with gender. I mean, you've got Mary sitting at his feet in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42, I believe it is.
Yeah.
Now, as to what that means, of course, you have the expression in about 1:1 where disciples would sit at the feet of the rabbis. But the question is, how does Luke use that expression? He uses it only one other place. That's in Acts 22:3, where Paul sits at the feet of Gamaliel. So she's taking the posture of a disciple, and Jesus actually commends her for that. Mm-hmm. He's being countercultural already. It's already getting on other people's nerves, including her sister, who wants her to be helping with the kitchen, which I can't blame Martha for that. I mean, the last time he had like 5,000 men plus women and children over for dinner. She's got to be ready with all this food. But anyway, that's it. Sorry, I keep digressing.
No, you're okay. You're okay. To that point, you have this natural. Okay, so women in that culture, not honored, respected the way that they ought to be. We would all agree on that. Yes. Why don't we see? And maybe I'm just ignorant to it. Why don't we see more scriptural evidence to condemn that? When we have, hey guys, you ought to treat yourselves this way. Don't be like the Gentiles, lording authority over one another. Why isn't there contextual evidence to suggest, hey, you're treating your women as subpar, as subhuman? You really need to make sure that they're,
You're
yeah. Say again. Oh, and I would never say that they are. No. I'm not saying that they are, but like, hey, you're treating these women in a way that's degrading, and I think that you would agree that in Jewish culture, in many situations, women could be treated as property, or treated or considered as lesser than. The fact that they could just sign a divorce paper and get rid of them, shun them. The culture was not typically.
Well, I think the thing is, we don't actually know what the culture is. We want to know.
Well, I mean,
is this,
certainly
this
in
is
Gentile culture,
is it true?
I mean, I've read in Gentile cultures, it's certainly this way.
I mean, this can be exaggerated, but we can definitely say that the culture was definitely not, um, neither complementarians nor egalitarians today in general in our culture would feel comfortable with first century Judean culture or Galilean culture,
Sure.
broader Mediterranean culture. That I think would be fair to say. They weren't, well, normally they wouldn't be treated as subhuman or something like that. Um, some of the things, though, yeah, the divorce, that was a male prerogative, as the Pharisees interpreted it. Of course, if you had money, you could get away with whatever you wanted to. But that's part of the issue. I mean, even what you said there about serving one another, following Jesus' example of serving one another. I mean, what is that supposed to address? Is that supposed to exclude? Okay, but not the women. If it's not excluding the women, then it obviously includes the women.
Yeah.
There were a whole lot of other inequities that the culture had to challenge, and Jesus was challenging them all the time. He wasn't hanging out with the elite. He was hanging out with the sick and the infirm and healing them. He was hanging out with those who were morally marginalized by their culture, tax collectors, sinners. He was hanging out with people who were economically marginalized.
The equivalent of like a telemarketer.
Teaching peasants. Yeah, he was. Yeah, he focused on the broken and the lowly. Even his disciples. I mean, fishermen and tax collectors. Those are the only occupations named. Those were pretty high up in terms of peasants, but in terms of the elite, no, they were nobody. I mean, Zacchaeus, he was a high-level tax collector, but in terms of his immediate disciples, no.
So if there were leadership inadequacies in roles as far as gender goes, that he didn't address those directly because it's really just an argument from silence. He was addressing the broader cultural in general and was constantly that's.
And some things would have to be left. I mean, the main issue was preaching the kingdom of God to the culture. Jesus lived to the values of the kingdom, but in terms of how to evangelize a hostile culture, again, you choose your battles. Mm-hmm. And so, the New Testament doesn't call for the abolition of slavery, but it gives principles that were used rightly by the abolitionists. I mean, that was one of the main arguments in the 1800s. I've read the arguments on both sides. And their hermeneutic is very informative. I mean, the pro-slavery arguments were, hey, it's in the Bible, it's in the Constitution, slavery is all right. And the anti-slavery arguments were, look, the biblical principles of justice and equity argue against this, biblical principles of liberation, biblical principles of valuing human life. And even if you look at and they look at it culturally. They say, okay, slavery was there in the culture, but does the Bible reduce it? Does the Bible move us in a direction that's more liberating? And I think we have the same thing with the roles of women. We don't want to exaggerate what it was in the culture. There were actually a range of views in the culture. But in terms of that range of views, Jesus' practice and Paul's teaching, and I know this is really debated by it's debated by a lot of people who are against the Bible, partly for this. They think Paul is putting down women, but you read Paul in light of the culture. That's not what he's doing at all. 1 Corinthians 14, if they want to learn something, let them ask their husbands at home. That seems to be the issue of the silence in 1 Corinthians 14. He can't mean all kinds of silence because, I mean, earlier in the same letter, women can pray and prophesy. Mm-hmm. And none of us, I think in most of our churches anyway, none of us think that women have to be completely silent because we let them sing. So, what kind of silence does he mean? Well, the one thing he addresses there is if they have any questions, let them ask their husbands at home. Why would they be asking questions is one issue. I'll just deal with that quickly, just to say that it was customary in ancient lecture settings, Jewish and Gentile alike, to interrupt with questions. Now, the issue of why it was the women, that's another issue that I'll come back to if there's time. But let me deal first with the thing that I said I was going to deal with in terms of let them ask their husbands at home. That doesn't sound very nice to us, at least to most of us. But in that culture, the vast majority of women over the age of 18 were married. This would especially be true among Greeks, where you had 30-year-old men marrying women who were 12 years their junior because of the practice of throwing out more female babies than male babies, as we can see from the business documents from Egypt, from the demographics of it. It's pretty clear from the census records, at least in some places, Greek dominated. And also, well, I'm going off again on another tangent. Let me get back to the thing. So most of the women were married. In terms of asking their husbands at home, Plutarch, who is one of the more progressive, maybe one of the most progressive voices in Greco-Roman antiquity. Xenophon would be another one, Musonius Rufus would be another one. But Plutarch, in his advice to bride and groom, says to Polyanus, the young man, okay, take an interest in your wife's learning. He says, most men don't think their wives can learn anything. So they don't take an interest, but you take an interest. And then he ruins it. He says, because if left to themselves, women produce nothing but base passions and folly. Well, Paul doesn't ruin it, but the fact that he wants the husbands to take an interest in their wives' learning, that's among the most, that's on the progressive end in terms of husbands dealing with their wives. Now, do you want me to deal with the question of why he doesn't want the women asking questions, even though he doesn't tell the men they're not allowed to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Why not? Yeah.
Okay. There are a couple possibilities here. And one of them is it was just considered unseemly for women to speak in public in front of other women's husbands. Not everybody shared that view by this period in Roman culture, but many people still did. And so that was the more conservative view. So avoid being a stumbling block. Are house churches public or are they private? I mean, after all, it's meeting in somebody's home. So you can see why that could become an issue of confusion. Another possibility has to do, and this also could inform 1 Timothy, the relative educational status of both genders. You do have some very educated women in antiquity. They stood out, and we have actually the names of some of them. But when you compare it to men, like for women, there were two advanced forms of education in the Greek and Roman world. Major forms of advanced education. One was philosophy, the other was rhetoric. We have only a handful of women who were philosophy teachers in antiquity. We have maybe one or two or three who were professors of rhetoric over the course of 1,000 years that we know of, whereas we know of hundreds of men. Women were not ordinarily trained in rhetoric, but all that's beside the point in terms of the Torah. There, what would be more important would be the Jewish context. And while women could learn about Torah in synagogue expositions, we normally don't have them studying with rabbis. Well, we never have them studying with rabbis. In this period, we have Beruria, the wife and daughter of a rabbi in the late 2nd century, who was known for her skill in domestic halakha, but the other rabbis wouldn't listen to her. And we also have a report of a woman who would sit in at the back of a rabbi teaching sometimes. The only rabbi that I know of in ancient Jewish literature who had actually a woman sitting as his disciple at his feet was Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then more to the point than that is boys were raised reciting the Torah. They were schooled in that. They were taught in that, whether they were literate or not, in terms of writing or even reading. They learned it orally. Girls were not. There was no concerted effort to teach girls in that. So you do have a radical imbalance of the male and the female in terms of who's going to be more skilled in this. When Paul says, let the women learn, that's a progressive statement, because, I mean, okay, they can't teach now. They can't interrupt lectures with questions now. But if they learn, the situation might be different. The same thing with 1 Timothy 2 with that, let them learn quietly and submissively. That's how all novices were expected to learn. And so if they're novices, well, of course, that's what's going to be expected of them.
So,
in first,
so in summary, it would be the equivalent of having a sixth grader in an eighth grader's class, and the sixth grader keeps raising their hand, asking a question, and it's holding back the whole class from getting through the session. So they're like, okay, eighth grader, take the sixth grader home and make sure to catch them up, because they have not been treated the same way as you have, so they don't have the level of knowledge that you have in this area. So your argument, but what you're saying that history has said is that women were not educated the way that they ought to have been, and because of the corporate assembly now, they had the right to ask the question, but they were holding back the corporate lecture.
Yeah, that is a really good illustration that I may be using from now on.
It is as long as you source the author.
He does want credit.
I source you when I quote you, so.
I got to remember where I got this one.
No.
The
Josh Lewis.
Is, this is the student that comes to class and asks a question that shows that they didn't do their homework.
Oh, there you go.
I use that illustration to inspire my students to do their reading before they come to class. But anyway, in 1 Timothy 2, he's dealing with false teachers. It's a big issue in 1st and 2nd Timothy. It's the one set of letters where it specifically prohibits women from teaching. Is it a coincidence that it's also the one set of letters where we specifically know that false teachers were targeting women with their teaching? Because in 1 Timothy 5, verse 13 or 14, I think, pretty sure it's 13, it speaks of women, widows, going about as the translations often say busybodies and something else. Well, one of those words actually means spreaders of nonsense, and in philosophic contexts, often spreaders of false teaching. I got that from Gordon Fee, talking about sourcing. I asked Gordon how sure he was about that. So he sent me a printout of every use of that Greek word in all of extant Greek literature. I said, okay, well, you did your
might
pretty
know.
confident.
But then even, I think, more clearly in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 6, it says that these false teachers are worming their way into households, leading astray weak-willed women. Why would they target the women? Well, is it that do women have less discernment because they lack a Y chromosome? Yeah. I mean, is it a biological feature that they don't have discernment, or is it, was it something in the environment that caused them to lack the discernment more than men would? But also another reason for targeting the women, and specifically for targeting widows, is in 1 Timothy chapter 5, is, well, where did the churches meet? Normally they met in homes. And which groups of women most often owned their own homes? Widows. And so, hey, you got your church building if you win over some widows to help propagate your teaching. So it's in the one set of letters that that we know that they were targeting the women with their false teaching. That's the one set of letters where Paul specifically prohibits women from teaching the Bible. And if we see this as Pauline, which I think most of us around here do, but if we see this as Pauline, I mean, we also have to take into account what Paul says about his women co-workers elsewhere. So it seems to me, in light of that, it makes more sense to say that Paul is dealing with an exceptional situation here, rather than saying this is a universal situation, and one that Timothy has spent a lot of time with him, if it were universal, already ought to have known about.
Yeah, so I want to definitely have you back on the show to talk about a specific given text. I'm glad that we were able to have this overarching conversation about the hermeneutic of this. I definitely want to drill into it, but I've only got you for like 6 more minutes.
Yeah, I know. I just like, I'm bummed.
So I would love maybe a closing question. I've got one, and I'll try to get you to have squeeze one in.
There is more on 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14, but I know we're cutting it.
Well, I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah, we can drill into one of these. My primary question is in the next chapter 3, where it talks about exclude. It presupposes eldership is male. He does this in Titus and in Timothy.
the husband of but one wife.
Exactly. Yeah. So he presupposes male there, as far as I can tell. Can you give me the reasoning behind? Again, this is a cultural thing. More than likely, the men were going to have leadership. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, especially in 1 Timothy, you would expect him to presuppose men right after 1 Timothy chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to have to be men. Also, where he says the husband of one wife, do elders have to be married in all cultures? Was
No.
Paul married at this point?
No. Yeah.
So
I figured it was a reference to polygamy, if I'm not, like, in
No,
other words, you
so
couldn't be a
his
polygamist.
argument is saying
it wouldn't be polygamy because polygamy wasn't really practiced.
it's a one-man woman, a one-woman man.
It could be practiced in Judea, but it wasn't practiced in Ephesus, where this letter is addressing. So it wouldn't be polygamy. It probably has to do with marital fidelity, but that's a whole other issue. But 1 Timothy chapter 4, part of the problem with the false teachers, they're forbidding to marry. So, and in Titus chapter 1, they're upsetting whole households. So, given this kind of false teaching, having heads of stable households was important. And also, they have to be above reproach. And Paul frames his argument in 1 Timothy 3 with that. He starts with that. Then they have to be of good reputation later on in the passage. So it's important that these are people who are respectable within the culture, given the pressures from outside the church, and also the false teaching. And he already says, with regard to the widows, some have turned aside after Satan. So I see he's drawing on universal principles, but he's articulating it in ways for these particular churches. And therefore, I would not see all of it as being transcultural. You have to.
So kind of a follow-up question. Again, only a few more minutes left in the show. And if we have to tackle it another time, just say cliffhanger. We'll do it next time. And that's perfectly fine with us.
And do other issues too.
Yeah,
Yes.
I know there are. Yeah. So the follow-up question would be, if it was a cultural context, to say the women were being deceived and targeted, there was an abuse of power that was taking place, would it then be appropriate to apply that principle in other contexts where there was an abuse of power and targeting women taking place? So if I go to an area where third wave feminism is super anti-Christ, it's super anti-male leadership, it's super anti-men in general, maybe usurping authority, like just think of the most atrocious form of targeting women's psyche of men and Christ and the church, would it be appropriate to come in there and say, yeah, women can't teach there either? If the principle
Teach what?
If the principle is that in Ephesus there was an abuse of power taking place, so women should not teach there, would it be appropriate to apply that principle in our day and age where there's an equal level of abuse of power?
If you had a setting where only women would be listened to, the most effective ministers to them would probably be women. But I mean, I would still try to minister to them, but they'd be more likely to listen to my wife than they would me to listen.
I guess the reciprocal question would, and again, maybe I know I only got 2 minutes. The hardest time I have with this is then in the areas that men are mostly deceived. We don't have prescriptions for would we also say that only women should teach there and the men should stay silent? I'm curious if this is a principle that, hey, can we apply this in other cultures? And should we, and how do we? If it is a principle, then I think it's almost more difficult than applying if it is across the board. That's where I have difficulty, and maybe you can speak to.
You have a lot of places where, like with micro financing,
Mm-hmm.
where they actually target the women for microfinancing because in those particular cultures, the men are more likely to go out and spend the money on liquor and so on, and the women are more likely to save the money and invest the money and improve the economy. Now, no, I don't think we have a situation like that in the biblical cultures. So we don't have an example like that in the biblical cultures. But if, talking about applying the principle to something like that, that's often done today. I think it would be discrimination if you've got a reliable man who could do something with that and you discriminate against him. But just as a general principle in those cultures, the women are more reliable with the money, and so they target the women.
Interesting. Well, like I said, we're definitely going to have you come back on because there's just too much to unpack in a single episode.
Yeah.
Michael,
this is super informative. Thank you so much.
It's an honor to have you on. I mean, for those of you who are out there watching the show, this is one of the foremost scholars on the subject. You need to go read his book. You wrote a book about women, early church history. Where do people pick that up?
You can get, it's called Paul, Women and Wives.
Mm-hmm.
You can get that through christianbook.com. You can get that through Amazon. There's also 2 views of women in ministry, something like that. The first one's published by Baker. The second one's published by Zondervan. And Linda Belleville and I wrote the egalitarian argument in there. And Tom Schreiner and Craig Blomberg, we're all friends, wrote the complementarian argument in there. And actually, Craig and Tom aren't exactly the same place in the argument. I mean, they're different. You talked about 1-point complementarians.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's different levels.
So many
of that.
shades of gray in there.
Be careful.
Maybe poor choice of words in modern context.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
am
no kidding.
The people who say you're not evangelical if you hold the other view. Look, there are evangelicals on both sides.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no question. And like I was telling, I don't think you've heard me say it, but I've said it on all the other episodes. I attend an egalitarian church. I've led in egalitarian churches. I've only led in egalitarian churches. This is not a deal breaking issue for me, and it shouldn't be for anyone out there. I think that the scholarship of Scripture and making sure that we're making our arguments based out of Scripture. You made the case at the beginning of the show, and I would love to kind of end on this note. The groups that are ordaining women and they're also ordaining homosexuals, it's not because they're ordaining women that they're ordaining homosexuals. It's because they're not taking the Scripture seriously, and they're just completely ignoring what Paul says. And if they're able to ignore what Paul says here, they can ignore what Paul says everywhere. It's not a hermeneutic. It's just a liberal attempt to just ignore Scripture altogether. And I think those are the churches.
Very lazy.
Those are the churches you got to get out of. It's not where they stand on this issue. It's how they approach Scripture, and if they're just willing to ignore texts. So
Yeah, that was such a great point about the slippery slope.
that was
Thank you.
really, really good point. Yeah, I'm gonna use that.
Me too.
And I'll source you on it too. I'll cite you.
Oh, thanks.
Dr. Keener, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll have you back on the near future. For those who are still watching, next couple of episodes are going to be really exciting. We're going to have Lauren on the show from Hole in My Heart podcast. We're having Tracy from Storehouse Ministry coming on. We're going to have Todd Wagner coming on. I think it's like on a Wednesday or a Thursday. It's a random day. And we just recently reached out to
Michael Bleeker,
Michael Bleeker, but
Shane and Shane.
yes, the Metaxas. Eric Metaxas.
He hasn't said yes yet.
No,
so
I'm taking it as a yes.
Yeah.
He said he'd be interested.
He's interested.
You guys tweet Eric Metaxas and be like, jump on Remnant Radio.
Yeah,
because we
let's
wanna,
harass
we want to
him.
bug him into it. So, Dr. Keener, thank you so much for coming on. And again, we're definitely going to have you back on to have more of this conversation. It was very helpful for us.
Thanks so much. I look forward to being with you again.
Cool. Be blessed. Hey, thank you guys so much for watching. You can tune in every single Monday night, 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Catch you later.
Oh, well,